Now, welcome to Handfuls of Purpose. We've now entered into the 10th week of restrictions as a result of this pandemic, and I'm sure that many of us are feeling the effects of it, the isolation, and some are experiencing loneliness as well as many other emotions. And so we're seeking in these messages to find encouragement, considering individuals who experience times of isolation and loneliness. And it's Paul writing to the Romans would say to them that the things that were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the scriptures might have hope. And so we're looking at characters that we read of in the Old Testament, in particular at this time. We thought upon Noah, and we're presently considering Elijah. And last week we left him in the home of the widow there in Zarephath. But today I want to read not in chapter 18, much as we would love to have read about the events in Mount Carmel, but to read in chapter 19, 1 Kings in chapter 19, and just the first 8 verses from verse 1. And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and withal how he had slain all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger unto Elijah, saying, So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And when he saw that, he arose and went for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongeth to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a juniper tree, and he requested for himself that he might die, and said, It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers. And as he lay and slept under a juniper tree, behold, then an angel touched him, and said unto him, Arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was a cake baked on the coals, and a cruse of water at his head. And he did eat and drink, and laid him down again. And the angel of the Lord came again the second time, and touched him, and said, Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee. And he arose, and did eat and drink, and went in the strength of that meat 40 days and 40 nights unto Horeb, the mount of God. As I was saying last week in our study, we left Elijah in the home of the widow. And of course, it was a very happy home. It was a home that had not only witnessed the providence of God in being supernaturally sustained with the meal that never wasted and the flask of oil that never ran dry, but also the widow and Elijah had witnessed the power of God in resurrection, because the widow's son died, and as a result of Elijah's prayer, God raised the child from the dead, and he was restored to his rejoicing mother. So that when Elijah left Zarephath, he left behind a woman that had become a woman of faith. And he's now moving on. God has commanded him to go and show himself to Ahab. And of course we then have the events that took place on Mount Carmel. And so we find that Elijah, he touches 5 different places in this chapter. We find him in 5 different locations. We're going to think about him first of all in Jezreel, and then to follow him 100 miles south to Beersheba, and then onwards a day's journey into the wilderness to the juniper tree, or as Mr. Darby renders it, the broom bush, and then to follow him for 40 days as he wandered in the wilderness and eventually arriving at Horeb. So these are the 5 places that we want to touch and try to find lessons for us in each of these places. To think first of all of Elijah arriving there at Jezreel. We want to contrast his arrival with his departure. And of course, when he arrived in Jezreel, he arrived in the power of the Spirit of God. He had just run non-stop for 20 miles, and he had run so fast that he outran Ahab in his horse-drawn chariot. And so we see a man that is being energized by the power of the Spirit of God. A man who has just experienced the display of divine power there on Mount Carmel as the fire descended from heaven in response to Elijah's prayer and consumed his bullock and the wood and even the stones of the altar and the water and the dust. And it resulted, of course, in Israel, those that were gathered of the nation, to fall down and to acknowledge that Jehovah, he is the God. And then, of course, there followed the slaughter of the false prophets of Baal, 450 of them at the hands of Elijah. And so we can begin to see God is working. And Elijah then goes to the top of the mountain and prays 7 times until that cloud the size of a man's hand appears, and the clouds grow darker and the wind rises, and eventually the heavens are opened. And so Elijah witnessed all these things, and he's now arrived at the gates of Jezreel, and if you like, he's on the mountain top. He has seen the hand of God in a wonderful way. He's seen what he believed was the beginnings of the recovery of the nation of Israel. It was Elijah's great burden to see this nation restored and living once again in fellowship with God and keeping their side of the covenant, that is the law that God had given them. This was Elijah's great exercise. This was what had driven him to pray for the withholding of the rains. And now things were happening. It would seem that God was on the move. And Elijah believed now that he was unstoppable, and that Jezebel would be swept aside, either through Ahab having been a changed man, as Elijah hoped he had been. Sadly, he wasn't. Elijah had ran before Ahab, thinking that the man running behind him in the chariot was perhaps going to be a different man, and perhaps would remove Jezebel and destroy Baal worship. But sadly, these things were not to be at that time. So that you can understand the anticipation that filled the heart of Elijah. God was working, and nothing could stop him, nor this mighty revival that was taking place. But he got a bit of a shock when the messengers came from Jezebel with the threat against his life. And Elijah, he could not accept this delay in the removal of Jezebel. He could not accept God's timetable. Elijah wanted action, and he wanted it now. And there crept into the heart of Elijah, I think, a little bit of rebellion in relation to the will of God. And as a result of that, he began to act out of character. the man who had waited upon God for 3.5 years in hiding. He had patiently waited God's time. That was his strong point. And yet, sadly, good men so often fail in their strong points. It says of Moses that he was the meekest man in all the earth, and yet he spake inadvisedly with his lips when he was provoked. And Elijah was a man of faith, a man who waited upon God, a man who would not act independently of God, and now sadly he is. And as a result of that, he becomes like every other man. He becomes weak, and he begins to panic at the thought of Jezebel wreaking vengeance on him. And instead of just waiting upon God and submitting to God's timetable, Elijah, sadly, he ran away. So that the man who left Jezreel was completely different from the man who'd arrived at Jezreel. Fellow believers, it's just a little reminder to us all that if we're not careful, we can change overnight, just in a moment. A wrong attitude towards God, a refusal to submit to the will of God. And we can be one day on the mountaintop and the next day in the valley of despair and despondency. And that's where Elijah was. And so he flees from Jezreel, and he travels 100 miles south. You can imagine the tremendous effort that required and how tired he was becoming. And when he arrived at Beersheba, he there leaves his young servant, and he goes on alone. You see, he's beginning to display the symptoms of depression. Now, I know that Elijah was suffering, I feel, a spiritual breakdown brought on by his own unbelief and lack of patience, waiting on God. But he was also suffering, I think, a mental breakdown, depression. And one of the symptoms of depression, of course, is withdrawal from other human company. And so he wants to be alone. He becomes withdrawn. He becomes taken up with himself. And so he leaves the company of his young attendant, his servant, and he goes on alone into the wilderness. Could I just say here at this point, when touching on the matter of mental depression, as believers, we're not exempt from the afflictions that afflict all men. And depression is an illness just the same way as cancer is an illness, and rheumatoid arthritis is an illness. And so believers can be beset with mental ill health. And I know personally of a number of believers who suffer from depression. And sometimes a Christian who finds themselves depressed reasons that it's because they're not spiritual enough. And, they don't understand that depression can be as a result of chemical lack in the brain, as well as other factors, years of stress and difficulties. And so let us just remind ourselves that depression is something which some believers are called upon to experience. And so Elijah was a very depressed man when he left Beersheba and made his way a day's journey into the wilderness and crawls under the juniper bush. That is what Mr. Darby describes it, as I've said, the broom bush, just a large shrub that would shade him from the sun. And there we see this mighty man of God, the man who the day before had ran, or a few days before, he had ran before the chariot in the power of the Spirit of God, and now we find him lying there beneath the juniper bush, depressed, exhausted, drained mentally, spiritually, emotionally, if you like, a mental and a spiritual wreck. And there he requests to God, now let me die. That's how low Elijah had got. He felt he could go on no longer. He wanted simply to die under that juniper bush and never to be seen again, just to lie in death, forgotten, there an unmarked grave. That was how low he had got. But not only that, he felt his unworthiness, his failure. He says, I'm no better than my fathers. He was marked by self-reproach. He felt his worthlessness. Is that what you feel, fellow believer, today? Perhaps I'm speaking to someone and that's just where you are. You're down and out, spiritually. You're in the deep valley of despair and despondency, and you can't see any way out. Well, I want you just to stay with me for a few moments and just see how tenderly and graciously God deals with his failing servant. No word of reproof from heaven falls upon Elijah, and certainly his prayer is not answered because his time for glory was not yet. See how graciously God ministers to his servant. When Elijah went into hiding at first, it was ravens, as Mr. Tommy Richardson said, the black-tailed waiters that waited upon him for a whole year. And then he knew the benevolence and kindness of the widow there in Zarephath. For 2.5 years, God used a widow. Here at the juniper bush, where his servant lies, down and out, he doesn't send ravens. He doesn't even send a poor widow with some bread and water. He sends an angel, a mighty angel, all the way from heaven, to minister to this helpless, frail servant of God. And there he awakens from sleep and finds bread baking on the fire and a cruse of water. And the process of physical and mental recovery begins. You see, he needed sleep, rest, not more prayer time, not more Bible time reading. When a believer is depressed, they can be so low that they can't even have the energy to pray or to read their Bible. And there was a dear brother in Glasgow, a servant of God, Mr. Tom Allen, and God put him on his back in serious illness. And he said that God put him on his back that he might look up, and that he was just lying there and just letting God love him. Fellow believers, don't punish yourself. Elijah slept, and God allowed him to sleep, and God fed him and sustained him, and a mighty angel ministered to him. And as a result of that, Elijah was restored physically there beneath the juniper bush. It's just a reminder of how much our Father loves us and how he cares for us. I'm thinking of the words of the Lord Jesus in Matthew and chapter 10 and verse 29 to 31. He says to his disciples, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father? But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear ye not, therefore, ye are of more value than many sparrows." Understand, dear child of God, whatever your condition may be, whether it's as a result of your own failure or whether it's a result of just circumstances that have overtaken you and you're experiencing ill health, whatever it may be, whether physical or mental, and you're feeling your weakness and your helplessness and perhaps a sense of worthlessness, could I remind you that the Lord Jesus loves you and the Father cares for you. I'm reminded of the experience of a couple, a Mr. and Mrs. Martin. He was an evangelist that served the Lord in the United States of America. And for a little while they resided in Elmira, in New York State. And they befriended a couple. Their name was Mr. and Mrs. Doolittle. And they became very close friends, and they often visited them. Now, Mrs. Doolittle was 20 years an invalid, and her husband was a crippled man that could only go to his work by means of a wheelchair. And yet they were a couple that were known for their bright testimony and their care for others. And whenever Mr. and Mrs. Martin visited them, they always found them the same, happy and bright in the Lord. One day, Mr. Martin asked the question to this lady. He asked her the secret of their bright hopefulness. She immediately replied. She said, "His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me." These words inspired Mrs. Martin, that is Sevilla Martin. She was a poetess. It inspired her to write a poem that very day, which was sent a day or two later to Charles Gabriel, who was a Christian composer, and he composed a tune for this lovely poem. And of course, the poem or the hymn is that lovely hymn, "His eye is on the sparrow." Let me just read it to you in closing, thinking of God's tender care, not only for Elijah, but his tender care for you, and the fact that you're on the heart and mind of the Lord Jesus, our great high priest, night and day. There's not a moment when he's not upholding us in prayer before the Father's face. And says that lovely hymn, it says, "Why should I feel discouraged? Why should the shadows come? Why should my heart feel lonely and long for heaven and home? When Jesus is my portion, my constant friend is he. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. Let not your heart be troubled. His tender word I hear, and resting on his goodness I lose my doubts and fears. Though by the path he leadeth, but one step I may see, his eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. I sing, says the refrain. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. For his eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. Whenever I am tempted, whenever clouds arise, when songs give place to sighing, when hope within me dies, I draw the closer to him. From care he sets me free. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. May the Lord bless this simple meditation and minister encouragement to those who perhaps, like Elijah, are feeling very down and depressed and worthless. May the Lord bless you. Thank you.